In 1944, the United States Army had a manual for everything: how to dress, how to march, how to salute, and how to die. Jake McNeese read that manual, used it to light a cigar, and then proceeded to single-handedly rewrite the rules of airborne warfare. The Army wanted soldiers who followed orders without question, men who saluted on time, kept their uniforms pressed, and never talked back to officers. Jake McNeese was not that soldier. He beat up military police, stole a train while drunk, and once threatened a staff sergeant over butter. And somehow this man would become one of the most decorated paratroopers of World War II. 4 combat jumps, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, the French Legion of Honor. He would save the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne when everyone expected him to die. He would complete impossible missions and then watch his own Air Force bomb the bridges he had just secured. The Army spent the entire war trying to get rid of Jake McNeese. They also spent the entire war needing him to save their operations. This is the story of a man the system couldn't contain and couldn't survive without. James Elbert McNeese, also known as Jake McNasty, was born on May 24, 1919, in Maysville, Oklahoma. He was 9 of 10 children in a family of Irish-American and Choctaw descent. The Great Depression hit Oklahoma hard. The McNeese family moved to Ponca City in 1931, scraping by like everyone else. Jake learned to hunt, fish, and trap before he learned algebra. When you're one of 10 kids during the Depression, you either help feed the family or you don't eat. He had his first full-time job at 10 years old. He worked through high school and kept working after graduation. By 1939, Jake was a firefighter for the War Department, working at the Pine Bluff Arsenal. He gained experience handling explosives, skills that would matter very soon. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Jake was exempt from the draft. Firefighters were essential workers, but Jake didn't want to be exempt. He wanted to fight. And not just fight anywhere. Jake wanted to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, land behind enemy lines, and blow things up. On September 1, 1942, Jake McNeese enlisted in the United States Army and volunteered for paratrooper duty. The extra $50 a month didn't hurt either. He was assigned to the Demolition Saboteur Section of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. The Army had no idea what they had just signed up for. Jake arrived at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, and immediately established himself as 2 things: the best soldier at any task the Army could throw at him, and a complete nightmare for his chain of command. It took exactly 1 week for the first incident. Jake was in the chow hall, getting his meal. He asked for butter with his bread. The staff sergeant running the line said no. Most soldiers would have accepted this and moved on. Jake was not most soldiers. He beat the staff sergeant unconscious over butter. The entire chain of command had an emergency meeting. On one hand, you cannot have privates assaulting staff sergeants over condiments. That's not how armies work. On the other hand, this is exactly the kind of aggressive lunatic you want dropping behind enemy lines to blow up bridges. They let it slide. A few weeks later, Jake was running the demolition course. He didn't just complete it. He set the course record, faster than anyone in the history of the training program. His commanding officer walked over to congratulate him. Jake looked the man in the eye and said if he thought that was impressive, he should see what Jake could do when he had some butter once in a while. The Army was beginning to realize they had a problem. At this point in the war, the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions had a policy. Every new recruit was promoted to private first class after 31 days of training. The reasoning was simple. These men had dangerous jobs ahead. Many wouldn't come home. The Army wanted them making a little more money to send back to their families before they died. Every single recruit got this promotion after 31 days. Jake McNeese got it, lost it, got it again, and lost it again. The Army's paperwork simply couldn't keep up with a soldier who was promoted for skill and demoted for behavior in the same week. Jake didn't care about rank. He didn't care about money. He didn't care about military protocol or looking good for inspections. Leadership now had a serious problem. Jake was too valuable to lose. But they couldn't have him mingling with regular soldiers and infecting them with his attitude. Their solution was innovative. They put Jake in his own platoon, by himself, made him the acting platoon sergeant despite whatever rank he currently held. Then every time they got another soldier just like Jake, a talented troublemaker the Army couldn't control, they shipped him over to join Jake's unit. The Dirty Five became the Dirty Seven. The Dirty Seven became the Filthy 13. The Army had accidentally created a monster. Jake and his men finished the first phase of training. They were given a pass to go into town one last time before shipping out to Fort Benning for Airborne school. They went to a bar. They got drunk. They ran into military police. One of Jake's men started talking back to an MP. The MP raised his nightstick to beat the soldier. Jake stepped in. He told the MP to let it slide. In Jake's own words, the man was so drunk he couldn't hit the floor with his hat in 30 throws. The MP told Jake to mind his own business and turned to strike. That was a mistake. Jake beat both MPs unconscious. He took their Colt .45 pistols, emptied all the ammunition into a nearby street sign, handed the empty guns back to the military police, and said now they could take him to jail. The next morning, Jake's commanding officer showed up at the stockade. He wasn't there to punish Jake. He was there with an offer. The Japanese held the world record for the longest forced march. The commander wanted to break it by having soldiers march 136 miles from Toccoa to Fort Benning. He thought Jake and his men might be able to do it. Was Jake interested? Jake said 136 miles wasn't a problem. He wouldn't change his socks, and he wouldn't get a blister. For anyone who's never done a ruck march, that's an insane claim. The kind of thing that would get most soldiers laughed out of the room. Jake did it. His men did it. They broke the record. The Army was beginning to realize something important. Whatever Jake McNeese said he could do, he could actually do. The problem was everything he did in between. By 1944, Jake and the Filthy 13 were stationed in England, preparing for the invasion of France. The unit had earned its nickname through creative hygiene practices. They refused to bathe more than once a week. To save their water rations for cooking wildlife, they poached from a nearby manor. The Army was eventually billed $10,000 for the damages. Nobody seemed surprised it was Jake's unit. But the training incidents were about to get much worse. A few weeks before D-Day, Jake stole a train. He got drunk in town and missed his ride back, so he found a train and drove it to base himself. A private in the United States Army, while intoxicated, committed grand theft locomotive and somehow navigated it back to his military installation. The Army didn't know whether to court-martial him or promote him. They also discovered that Jake had blown up part of his own barracks. The official classification was somehow recorded as high spirits rather than felony sabotage. First Sergeant Albert Miller and the company commanders knew Jake was the regiment's secret weapon. They just had to keep him out of prison long enough to use him. June 5th, 1944. The invasion of Normandy was hours away. Jake's unit had been assigned a mission that bordered on suicidal. They would jump with the 3rd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and secure or destroy the bridges over the Douve River. This would prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches where American soldiers would be landing at dawn. The jump was expected to be catastrophic. Paratroopers would be scattered across miles of enemy territory in complete darkness. Many would die before they hit the ground. Jake decided his men needed something to focus on besides their own mortality. He was part Choctaw. He had an idea. Jake shaved everyone's head into a mohawk. Then he noticed the C-47 sitting on the airfield. Ground crews had just painted black and white invasion stripes on every aircraft so Allied gunners wouldn't shoot down their own planes. The paint was still wet. Jake walked over and started scooping paint off the fuselage. He applied war patterns to his face, then started painting his men. A Stars and Stripes photographer was there to capture it. Those images would become the most iconic photographs of the American Airborne Forces in World War II. When people think of D-Day paratroopers, they think of the filthy 13 in war paint. Jake later explained his reasoning. If the Germans were already scared of paratroopers, this would make them look completely insane. His son would later describe Jake's thinking more simply. Making them look crazier couldn't hurt. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Charles Mellon. He was one of the few officers who actually got along with Jake's unit. In a few hours, Lieutenant Mellon would be dead, and Private Jake McNeese would be leading the mission. The planes took off after midnight on June 6, 1944. Jake's unit jumped into darkness over France with the 3rd Battalion. The drop was a disaster. Paratroopers were scattered across miles of countryside. The thick cloud cover made it impossible for pilots to maintain formation. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through the transport planes. Some men died when their parachutes didn't have time to open. Others drowned in flooded fields the Germans had created as defensive measures. Jake landed alone in an open field and immediately started moving toward his objective. The first friendly face he found was a fellow paratrooper named Lou Lip, who had broken his back during the fall and couldn't move. He kept moaning their training phrase over and over. There was nothing Jake could do for him. After 2 hours of dodging German patrols, Jake started linking up with other American soldiers. They stumbled into a German headquarters, opened fire, and killed everyone inside. Around 3 in the morning, they reached the Douve Canal. Jake would later describe what he found. Lieutenant Mellon was dead. So were several other members of the Filthy 13. Some had been captured. Some were still missing. Of the 20 men Jake led into Normandy, he would come out with 2. But the mission wasn't finished. The bridges still needed to be secured, and Private Jake McNeese was now in command. Jake gathered what was left of his men and every straggler he could find along the way. They pushed toward the Douve River bridges near Bravans. No officers. No communication with higher command. Just a private leading a handful of survivors toward their objective. None of that mattered to Jake. The mission was the mission. They reached the bridges and accomplished their objective. The Filthy 13 secured the infrastructure that would prevent German reinforcements from counterattacking the landing beaches. Then they dug in and waited, fighting off German probes for days. Colonel Robert Sink, commanding officer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had no communication with Jake's sector. He had no idea his men had succeeded. Sink looked at the situation and made a reasonable assumption. Given the catastrophic drop, the heavy casualties, and the complete radio silence, he concluded the mission had failed. So Colonel Sink ordered P-51 Mustangs to destroy the bridges at Bravon. The bridges Jake McNeese and his men had just secured at the cost of half their unit. Their own Air Force bombed them. Think about what that means. They completed the suicide mission. They held against German counterattacks. They watched their friends die. And then American planes destroyed their own objective because command assumed nobody could have survived. Jake and his remaining men held their position until June 8th, when they were finally relieved by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Filthy 13 had accomplished the impossible. Command just didn't know it yet. Jake survived D-Day. The Filthy 13 was rebuilt with replacements. And in September 1944, they jumped again. Operation Market Garden was supposed to be the operation that ended the war by Christmas. Paratroopers would seize bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor for Allied armor to drive straight into Germany. It didn't work out that way. Jake's demolition platoon was assigned to defend 3 bridges over the Dommel River in Eindhoven. They took the bridges without a fight. Then the German bombers came. The bombing of Eindhoven killed or wounded half the men in Jake's platoon. The survivors fought their way through tanks and infantry, removing German explosives from bridges, improvising constantly. Jake found an abandoned German truck and drove his men into town. They dodged 88mm artillery rounds and fought house to house. For the rest of the campaign, the demolition men secured the regimental command post and protected wire-laying details. Jake was promoted to platoon sergeant. Given his performance, it was the only rational choice. Then he went AWOL to Paris. When he came back, Captain Gene Brown had an offer. The Army was getting rid of troublemakers. Brown liked Jake, but couldn't protect him anymore. There was one option: volunteer for Pathfinder School in England. Clean slate. New start. Jake thought about it. Pathfinder missions were supposed to be suicide runs, jumping ahead of everyone else to mark drop zones. But the war had to be almost over, right? He probably wouldn't even make another jump. Then he remembered something else. Pathfinder School was in Chalgrove, England, near Oxford, a major university town where all the young men were off at war. Jake volunteered immediately. Half the surviving Filthy 13 followed him. They thought they were done making combat jumps. They were wrong. December 1944. The Germans launched their final major offensive of the war. 30 German divisions smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. They created a massive bulge in the Allied front and surrounded the town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped inside that town. They were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The weather was brutal. Snow, freezing temperatures, almost zero visibility. Air resupply was nearly impossible because pilots couldn't see the drop zones. The 101st was dying. Someone had an idea. Send in the Pathfinders to set up beacons and guide the supply planes. Jake McNeese had just settled into his comfortable training assignment in England. Clean sheets, hot food, no combat. Then his commanding officer informed him the Pathfinders were jumping into Bastogne. The expected casualty rate was 80 to 90%. The mission was effectively suicide. Jake had volunteered for Pathfinder School specifically to avoid making another combat jump. Now he was being dropped into the most desperate battle of the war. 20 Pathfinders jumped into the frozen hell of Bastogne on December 23, 1944. They were descending at 160 miles per hour in the dark, using parachutes they couldn't steer, into a surrounded position where German forces outnumbered the defenders. Everyone expected most of them to die. The Pathfinders landed. One man died on the drop. That was a 5% casualty rate, compared to the expected 80 to 90%. Jake McNeese had beaten the odds again. They immediately got to work. Jake and his men set up radio beacons on opposite sides of Bastogne. They knew the Germans could triangulate their signals and call in artillery on their positions. So they improvised. One team would call in a resupply drop, then pack up and move. The other team would call in the next drop from a different location. They bounced the signal back and forth all day, never staying in one place long enough to get killed. The numbers tell the story. In 5 days, 20 Pathfinders guided in nearly 1,000 resupply aircraft. Close to 1,000 C-47 transport planes dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies into a surrounded position. 20 men, 1,000 planes. The entire division's survival. The 101st Airborne received enough ammunition, food, and medical supplies to hold until General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines. Of the 20 Pathfinders who jumped into Bastogne expecting to die, 19 walked out. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later say that the aerial supply drops and the Pathfinders who made it happen were the reason for America's success at Bastogne. Colonel Sink put Jake and his men in for Silver Stars. Then Sink changed his mind. In his opinion, they were just doing their jobs. He downgraded the recommendation to Certificates of Merit. It would take decades for those to be upgraded to the Bronze Stars they deserved. That's the Army Jake McNeese served in. Save the division, spend the rest of your life fighting for recognition. Most paratroopers made one combat jump during World War II. 2 was unusual. 3 was rare. Jake McNeese was about to make his 4th. In February 1945, Patton's advance had outrun his supply lines. The 90th Infantry Division was cut off and needed resupply. They called Jake. On February 13, 1945, Jake jumped into Prüm, Germany. He guided in the supplies that kept the 90th Division fighting. The war was effectively over. Germany was collapsing. Jake and what remained of the Filthy 13 adopted a holding position, which in their case meant finding creative ways to celebrate victory. Jake's unit ended up billeted in the abandoned castle of Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful Nazi leaders in Germany. Göring had been collecting the spoils of conquered Europe: wine, whiskey, the best Nazi money could steal. And apparently he was a racehorse enthusiast, because every famous racehorse from every country Germany had invaded had been shipped to his castle. Jake and his men looked at a fortune in stolen thoroughbreds sitting in the barn. So they threw a rodeo, because that's what the Filthy 13 did. While drunk on Nazi liquor and riding Nazi horses at the Nazi rodeo, Jake met a young woman named Amelia. They hit it off immediately. As it turned out, Amelia's father was the leader of the local chapter of Hitler Youth. Jake McNeese, the part Choctaw paratrooper who had just spent 3 years killing Nazis, was now dating the daughter of an actual Nazi official. He was drinking the man's wine, riding the man's stolen horses, and showing his daughter that America had its advantages. It was the most perfect ending to Jake's war that anyone could have scripted. And it actually happened. Jake finished the war as the acting first sergeant of Headquarters Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The man who could never stay at one rank had risen to one of the most important enlisted positions in the regiment. Not because he played politics, not because he followed the rules. Because when everything was falling apart and the mission seemed impossible, Jake McNeese was the man the Army needed. But the war was over now, and Jake was about to learn what happens to sledgehammers when there's nothing left to break. Jake was sent back to America to reconstruct an ear mangled in combat. He was transferred to an Army hospital in Arkansas. It took exactly 1 trip into town for Jake to get in another fight with military police. He was thrown in the stockade, again. After his ear was repaired, the MP commander informed Jake they never wanted to see him on their post again. Jake told the commander that if they ever saw him again, he would be a civilian, and then he would kick the commander's ass. The MP commander filed charges. Jake was chaptered out of the United States Army. His military career ended on February 26, 1946, after 3 years, 5 months, and 26 days of service. 4 combat jumps, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts. The man who saved Bastogne, discharged because he couldn't stop fighting MPs. That's how it goes for the men who don't fit the system. Absolutely necessary during war. Completely intolerable during peace. Jake didn't seem to mind. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Plus, he had a substantial amount of cash he had liberated from various safes across Europe. The post-war years were hard. Jake drifted from town to town, job to job. He battled alcoholism. He got in bar fights, not because he started them, but because every local tough guy wanted to prove something against the famous paratrooper. Then one night, Jake almost killed himself in a drunk driving accident. Missed a concrete barrier by inches. That was the wake-up call. Jake defeated his alcoholism. He found God. He found a wife named Martha. For the next 28 years, Jake McNeese worked at the post office in Ponca City, Oklahoma, selling stamps, delivering packages, being a friendly neighbor. Nobody in that small town had any idea their mailman was one of the most decorated paratroopers of World War II. In 2012, France awarded Jake the Legion of Honor, their highest decoration for military merit. The country he had helped liberate 68 years earlier finally said thank you. Jake McNeese died on January 21st, 2013. He was 93 years old. When asked in an interview how he managed to survive all his impossible missions, Jake had an answer. He said he thought he made it because God didn't have anywhere to put him at that point in time. Heaven and hell were the only two options, and God knew Jake would have goofed up either one of them. So here he was,